On today's show, the Houston Rockets reportedly going star hunting this offseason. Why there's one star player mentioned in the bunch that does make sense for this Houston Rockets team, plus final NBA draft thoughts, predictions, and so much more. It's all coming up on today's Locked On Rockets.
This is Mission Control, Houston.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Happy NBA draft evening to all. What's up and welcome to another edition of Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, native Houstonian and credentialed media member. I'm also the host of Locked On NBA Mondays. Be sure to follow along wherever you listen to your podcasts or on YouTube. Just search Locked On Rockets. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. That's the best way you can help our show out, is to go comment anything below the YouTube video. Even if you just swing by and say go Rockets, it helps us out a ton. Now, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more with FanDuel. This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. And as always, thank you so much for making Locked On Rockets part of your day every single day, whether it's on your way to work, on your lunch break, in the gym. Thank you for being an everydayer. So much to get to on today's show. I mentioned it, I teased it at the end of our last show, but there are some rumors, some reports out there about the Houston Rockets and their desire, their eagerness to go star hunting, their desire to make some win now moves this offseason. We're going to tackle that across the first couple segments here, and why there is one name, one quote-unquote star player who I think does make a lot of sense if Houston is able to make the push to acquire him. More on that here in just a second, as well as final thoughts ahead of the NBA draft, which is going to be taking place Wednesday night. So we are, at the time of me recording this, a little more than 24 hours away from the NBA draft. A lot could go down with this Houston Rockets team and that number 3 overall selection. Will they stay at number 3? Will they trade down from number 3 a little bit further back in the lottery or deeper into the draft? Will they trade out of the draft completely? And if they do stay at number 3, who are they going to take? Is it going to be Donovan Clingan? Is it going to be Reed Sheppard? It could be somebody else completely random. We're going to tackle all of that on today's show. Let's start with the star hunting rumors. So Jonathan Givony was reporting the other day that the Rockets are clearly in win now mode and would love to add star power to their roster with players such as Kevin Durant, Jimmy Butler, Mikal Bridges, and Brandon Ingram, as well as role players including Brook Lopez and Marcus Smart being some that other teams say the Rockets could have interest in targeting, with some names more far-fetched than others. Now, I want to start right there because there are some names on this list that I just don't make sense for a variety of reasons, right? So first off, the two really big star names at the top of the list, Kevin Durant, Jimmy Butler. Look, it feels like Phoenix is trying to salvage that whole situation over there, and I don't think we're at the stage yet where Kevin Durant is going to be demanding a trade or requesting out of Phoenix. I'm sure that we will cross that bridge at some point in the not so distant future. If a few things go wrong with Phoenix to start this next season, maybe we see another KD trade request, trade demand by the midway point of next season, what have you. Doesn't feel like Phoenix is going to be content to try to move on from KD this offseason, at least as it stands right now. And then the Jimmy Butler thing, right? Maybe Jimmy Butler's run his course in Miami. You know, it's going to be tough. He's getting up there in age. He's got a lot of miles on him. And maybe the Heat are in a position where they'd be better served, dealing Jimmy right now, getting back, good value for him, and focusing on building around Bam Adebayo, Tyler Herro, and whatnot moving forward with the assets also that they get back from a Jimmy trade. I don't think either of those two names are realistic. They're just not. It doesn't make any sense, right? Like, the Rockets are not in a position to push their chips to the center of the table. So when you talk about the Rockets, or when Givony talks about the Rockets being in quote unquote win now mode, there's a difference between being in like championship or bust win now mode and just being in a mode where you're ready to continue adding impact players, veteran pieces, or just flat out just upgrades to the roster, right? Like, if you can upgrade one position on your roster without giving up any of the young core, or, you're not dipping too much into your future assets, your war chest, if you will, then yeah, like upgrading a position, like if you could upgrade the small forward position, upgrade Dillon Brooks to another player, then yeah, absolutely you do it. Obviously Kevin Durant would be an incredible star to add to this team. Hell, adding Jimmy Butler would be incredible, but I don't think either of those options are realistic. Now, the Mikal Bridges stuff we have beaten to death here on Locked on Rockets, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that. Mikal Bridges and Brandon Ingram are clearly not in the same tier of star player as KD or Jimmy. They do, I think, move the needle a little bit, but as we talked about on our last episode, the Rockets already reportedly turned down a Brandon Ingram for Alperen Sengun straight swap. Now, we don't know if there would be other pieces going to New Orleans or coming to Houston or whatever involved in that trade. But even if the core of the trade was Sengun for Ingram as a swap, Rockets already said no to that. Now, maybe there's another framework, maybe there's another version of that deal where the Rockets could get it done without giving up Sengun or without giving up any of the core six, and New Orleans would be, willing to accept an offer like that. Who knows? Brandon Ingram I don't think moves the needle too much for me though, because he's clearly, I don't want to say a flawed star, but he's due for a massive payday, and he doesn't fit what the Rockets want to do stylistically. He doesn't shoot threes, and that's the whole issue right now with him in New Orleans, is he's not the right star to pair next to Zion Williamson, because Zion needs somebody who can space the floor next to him. And Brandon Ingram has been so reluctant to shoot the three ball in his career that now the Pelicans are forced to try and find a way to move on from him, because they also don't want to pay him all that money. So Ingram, not realistic. Rockets already reportedly turned down an offer there. Mikal Bridges is the other name. And again, if the Nets want to, stop digging their heels in and actually come to the realization that their current building path or whatever, the current, direction that their franchise is headed is just straight towards the treadmill of mediocrity, then yeah, maybe you have those conversations. Maybe you can talk about some version of a Nets pick swap where the Rockets get Mikal Bridges. Fine. We've beaten that to death. Maybe that's a possibility. The other names that are a little bit interesting here, right? We saw Brook Lopez, we saw Marcus Smart. We've talked a little bit about some of the trade hypotheticals with the Memphis Grizzlies in the last few weeks here at LOR. KOC, Kevin O'Connor with The Ringer, did go on a pod recently and said Memphis has not and will not offer Marcus Smart and pick number 9 to trade up to pick number 3. So that's a pretty definitive statement from KOC. So I do think that one is probably out the window at this point, which is a little frustrating, because that was one of the trade down scenarios that I thought had the most legs behind it, because again of Ime Udoka's previous relationship with Marcus Smart and the Grizzlies' reported desire to target Donovan Clingan. Now, some of that might have to do with the fact that Donovan Clingan may just be off the board by the time the Rockets are picking at number 3. Maybe things change if Clingan is there on the board at 3 and the Rockets are willing to draft him and then trade back with the Grizzlies, and that shakes some things up a little bit there. But the one name that was not mentioned in Gavoni's pod that I do think carries some weight, and there was some reporting about this both recently in the last few days, as well as something that we talked about here on the show like 6 weeks ago, and that is a potential opt-in and trade for one PG-13, Paul George. We're going to explain why that makes a lot of sense and why that would be the one star-laden move, star-hunting move that could actually work out in favor for the Houston Rockets this offseason. We're going to get there in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Look, I love sports. I love them so much, I never really want them to stop. But as you got the playoffs winding down and we get fewer and fewer games and the sports they're not sportsing the way you want them to. Look, FanDuel lets you keep the sports going whenever you want. All you have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime you're in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Right now, you can head over to FanDuel.com and take a look at the outright betting favorites for this year's NBA draft. Right now, Zachary Reese still the favorite to go number 1 overall at minus 280. The number 2 overall pick, Alex Sarr, at a whopping minus 700 to go number 2 overall to the Washington Wizards. And then for the Houston Rockets, Reed Sheppard, still the favorite, minus 210 to be the number 3 overall selection, with Donovan Clingan right behind him at plus 260. Which way will the Rockets ultimately go? For all those odds and so much more, be sure to visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and start making the most out of your summertime. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of NBA. And continuing on here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. All right, so kind of just to, I hit on this a little bit in segment one. I want to make sure I send this point home is there's a difference between being in win now mode and like trying to win a championship versus just taking those steps towards improvement, right? And we talked about this in a pod 6 weeks ago when the Clippers were in their first round series with the Dallas Mavericks. And I brought this up as a distinct possibility that, hey, if the Clippers flame out in round one, Paul George hasn't been able to figure out a contract extension with the Clippers. There's probably some frustration there. If they lose again, if they have a disappointing first round playoff exit, then what does his future hold ultimately? Now, Mike Scotto from USA Today reported that the Houston Rockets are big game hunting, and one of the many notable names on their radar is Paul George, league sources told Hoops Hype. George could potentially exercise his $48.8 million player option to facilitate a trade to his next destination. But currently, the chances of Houston landing George are unlikely, sources said. So, while it's worth noting, right, that you highlight it right, and I do know that there has been some interest both recently and kind of historically from the Rockets front office in Paul George, it's always been a situation where they've just kind of monitored and they've never really been thinking, oh, well, we could realistically get him, right? The issue here is trying to figure out what does Paul George want. Now, he was on a podcast recently on his podcast kind of talking about, his mentality about what he wants at this stage of his NBA career, that it's less about only trying to win championships, and it's more about style of play and this, that, and the other. And I'm paraphrasing here, but there were a lot of little anecdotes from a recent pod that he did where you're kind of like scratching your head like, hey, okay, maybe, why is PG's mentality shifting all of a sudden? Now, there were a couple teams that were reportedly in the running for PG this offseason as far as just signing him outright as a free agent, and those two teams were the Orlando Magic and the Philadelphia 76ers. The Sixers reportedly recently have just completely pulled out of the PG race. So when you look at that, when you start trying to take a look at some of the tea leaves here, and then you also factor in that PG kind of unprompted, right, at various points in time has given the Rockets a lot of praise on his show. He goes on there, he's given a lot of praise to Jalen Green, a lot of praise to Alperen and Sengun. They've both been on his show before. Recently, he gave another shout out to Houston about just their level of play and how good they were at the end of the season, that they really started figuring some things out. And then you also factor in the Ime Udoka angle, right? And that Ime is, a guy that a lot of players in the NBA would love to play for. There's a lot of good things being said about him in locker rooms around the league. That's a coach that there are a lot of players that would love to come to Houston just because of Ime. That was one of the reasons that getting Ime as the Rockets head coach was such a big get last year, 1 year ago, last summer, whatever, because that's the type of kind of cachet that he has around the NBA. So you start to look at all these little loose threads and you start to connect the dots and you start thinking, man, there really is a realistic pathway, a possibility that depending on what PG wants, right, he could very easily facilitate a trade to the Houston Rockets, not unlike the trade that Chris Paul facilitated to the Rockets from the Clippers all those years ago. All he has to do is tell the Clippers, hey, look, I can walk for nothing and you guys can lose me for absolutely nothing, and I can go sign with the Magic, or I can go, reach back out to the 76ers and sign with them, or what have you. Now, the problem is he has to have those offers in hand. There has to be a legitimate threat for him to go to one of those other teams. Otherwise, the leverage doesn't quite work in PG's favor. Or there has to be outright leverage for the Rockets to be able to acquire PG and sign him outright this offseason without the need to trade for him. Now, if you remember back when the Rockets did trade for Chris Paul during the James Harden era, the Rockets could have and would have been able to offload salary enough to sign Chris Paul outright that offseason. Now, by Chris Paul opting in, it actually helped the Rockets quite a bit. They were able to hold on to a couple extra pieces. They didn't have to offload the Ryan Anderson contract, all these different moves that would have had to be made to open up the cap space to get Chris Paul outright. Now, I don't think the Rockets are in a position right now to be willing to or even capable of offloading enough salary to sign Paul George outright. So that threat doesn't really exist. But the threat that does exist is if PG has one of those other offers in hand, and if Houston seems like a desirable enough location for him to put them on a short list and say, hey, here's my list of teams that I'm willing to be traded to. It's Houston and Team X, Team Y, whatever, and he hands that list to the Clippers. At that point, all the Rockets have to do is beat out the other names on that list. And again, some of this has to come down to, do the Clippers think it's a worthwhile deal enough to humor Paul George on this opt-in and trade scenario? The Clippers don't have to agree to trade him. If he opts in, then he's kind of stuck in no man's land, just like James Harden was last year or at the beginning of this past season with the 76ers. He opted into his player option, and then he had a stalemate with the Clippers for the start of the season, and then eventually they folded. They traded him to the Clippers. The Sixers traded him to the Clippers, and it's all she wrote. I don't expect that to be the situation with the Clippers with Paul George. I don't expect there to be some awkward stalemate where he just refuses to play or shows up to training camp late or any of those antics that we see the Beard pulling out when he gets frustrated with a situation. But you start looking at what the Rockets could conceivably offer to LA in this package. And this is why I think this is the one star trade that does work in favor of the Rockets and that I would be open to and honestly encouraged by if the Rockets could facilitate. And that's because I don't think the Rockets would be trading for PG-13 to be the star player. They wouldn't, right? They have players on their roster that are currently blossoming stars, right? Alperen Sengun, Jalen Green. These guys are players that are capable of becoming legit bona fide stars in the league, right? And there's still very high hopes for Jabari, for Tari, obviously Cam and Amin, the two newest recruits on the block. So I think that if the Rockets were able to finesse a trade for PG-13, his role would be much similar to that of Fred VanVleet this past season, where if you could upgrade that starting small forward spot and you go from Dillon Brooks to PG-13, that is a pretty substantial upgrade. Like, in a vacuum, PG-13 is a significantly better player than Dillon Brooks is right now by himself. He's a much more dynamic offensive player. He can catch fire and win you a game by himself. Defensively, he's probably a slightly more versatile defender than Dillon Brooks is. And again, for the last about 1/3 of last season, it really felt like Dillon Brooks' defense had kind of fallen off a little bit. So if you're the Rockets and you were able to put together an offer of something like Dillon Brooks, expiring salaries like Jae'Sean Tate, Jock, Landale, Jeff Green, whatever, all those expiring salaries to get up to the $48.8 million player option that PG has. And then you throw in some draft capital, right? You probably have to include the number 3 overall pick from this year's draft. Maybe not even that, though. Maybe not even the current number 3 overall pick. Maybe you could get away with keeping it and you just include future draft capital, like some of the Nets picks or some of your own picks further down the line. That's the question, is how much would it ultimately cost? Because again, PG does have some leverage here. And when a player has leverage in a situation like this, you're not going to be able to get a king's ransom for him because you're going to need PG's cooperation to be able to send him to whatever desired location he wants. Now, PG has until Saturday, June, I believe it's 29th. I want to double check the date on that. Saturday the 29th to exercise his player option or choose to become a free agent. Even though it seems kind of unlikely, I do think it's a move that would make a ton of sense, and it allows PG to kind of, I don't want to say fade off into the sunset, but just it allows him to take a step back, and he no longer has to be that number 1 or number 2 option. He gets to be more so of an ancillary piece where Sengun and Jalen are still going to be your heavy hitters. They're going to be the big guns for the Rockets this next season. And then situationally, on certain nights or certain matchups or whatever, then yeah, you're going to have games where Fred can step up or Paul George can step up or somebody else on the Rockets roster can step up and win you the game and be the best player on the floor that night, as opposed to the current style of play for the Clippers where it's your turn, my turn, with Kawhi and PG and Harden and Russ all taking turns isolating, which is why the Clippers led the league in isolations, or second leader in isolations, whatever. It was Mavericks and Clippers were 1 and 2 at the top. I can't remember who was who, but like that's kind of an exhausting play style, right? To have to do every night, 82 games out of a season and into the postseason as well. So when you take his comments about play style into account, when you take his comments about the Rockets being on the upswing and being really impressed with what they've done and how much he really likes Jalen Green, Alperen, Sengun, all that. If you can get Paul George and the only main asset you're giving up is Dillon Brooks and potentially some draft capital and then salary filler, that I think is a slam dunk trade and exactly the type of move you'd like to see this Rockets team make to not shake the boat on the young guys, but to give them yet another piece that pushes them even further up the Western Conference rankings. So that's my argument for why a Paul George trade makes a lot of sense. Now, is it realistic? Are there other teams that are going to be in the running for the PG sweepstakes? Absolutely. Would the Rockets be able to outbid those other teams? If they really wanted to, probably. But that becomes the issue, is you don't want to overpay. I don't think any of these aging stars, whether it's KD, Jimmy Butler, Paul George, I wouldn't touch any of the core six to trade for an over-the-hill star to get a 1 to 2 year window where maybe you can get like a lucky upset in the first round where you like break in as like a play-in team and you have this like, you know, scrappy upstart team of young players plus like 1 or 2 oldies that are trying to like get something done in the playoffs, and you have like, I don't know, your ceiling of that team becomes like a second round exit at best, right? That's not the formula for long-term success, but I do like the framework of the PG deal if something like that were to arise. So it's worth highlighting again. Just wanted to tackle it and make sure that we discussed it on today's show. But coming up, want to get into final NBA draft thoughts. Donovan Clingan, Reed Sheppard, who's the pick going to be for the Houston Rockets? All that good stuff coming up here in just one moment. And final segment here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. All right, so final thoughts here as we approach the NBA draft. And I'll say one thing. I got a lot of flack for the last show that we put out, basically sharing what my perception, what my understanding of how the Rockets are trying to approach this draft is. Mainly because of me voicing the opinion that, or not even the opinion, just that I think what would happen if Clingan and Sheppard were both on the board together, that the Rockets would take Donovan Clingan. First off, it doesn't even seem like Clingan's going to be there at pick number 3. It seems all signs are pointing towards the Hawks taking Clingan number 1 and the Wizards taking Sarr number 2. And then neither of the bigs are going to be on the board. And then great, Reed Sheppard becomes a Houston Rocket. Awesome. In a vacuum, I like Reed Sheppard more than Donovan Clingan for this Rockets team, and for a variety of reasons, right? I think he's got an elite shooting trait, skill, whatever you want to call it, but he's so much more than that. He's so much more than just a shooter, and I think it's a disservice to look at Reed Sheppard and say, oh, he's just a shooter. He's an undersized guard. He's just a shooter. That's all. No, he brings so much more to the table as a very solid, reliable defensive piece, somebody who understands how to defend at the team level very, very well. Offensively, he is a shooter, but he's a shooter in a variety of ways, right? He can shoot playing off ball, catch and shoot. He can shoot off motion, whether it's coming off screens, little DHO actions. He can create for himself. He can shoot off the dribble. And he can play make, right? He can run point. He can run an offense, whether it's in transition, whether it's in the half court. He's just a really polished, high floor player. So I do think there's a lot of arguments in favor of taking Reed Sheppard. My biggest holdup and why I thought that, again, if both were available at pick 3 is because I think that Rafael Stone, the Rockets general manager, Rafael Stone, is probably lower on Reed Sheppard than he would be Donovan Clingan, given we look back at historical draft precedent, right? The players that Stone tends to target in the draft, the players that we can like point to and say, yep, those are the Stone picks. Or even outside of that, even pointing to guys like Kevin Porter Jr., who the Rockets were infatuated with for years, right? One of Rafael Stone's guys, one of his pet projects. They all have certain underlying similarities, right? They are, position, a lot of positional versatility, right? Guys who are tweeners or can play multiple positions on the floor, guys who are really athletic. Tends to be, 99th percentile athletes with like insanely high upside, right? That's the Jalen Green pick, the Paolo Banchero infatuation before Jabari fell to pick number 3. And then last year, Amin Thompson. So Reed Sheppard does not fit that draft profile. And that's why, depending on who has the most weight to throw around in the Rockets draft war room, I do think Reed would pass in flying colors for Eli Whitus for the analytics side. And then even the defensive angle that Reed Sheppard provides, I think would impress and would make Ime Udoka happy, as well as the shooting. Ime's talked about shooting being at a premium at the NBA level. So I do think Ime and Eli would be all in on Reed Sheppard. I think that Donovan Clingan would be the guy where if Stone was kind of going back and forth between the two guys, I feel like he would say, let's take Clingan. So with that, and I think that Clingan would also work in favor of the analytics models because he's got a lot of strong analytics backing him. And then on top of that, he's obviously a defensive monster. So Ime would be a huge fan of that. There's a reason the Rockets went after Brook Lopez in the first place 1 year ago. So I say all that to say, though, that if I got my perfect draft night scenario, it would be this. And this is my official prediction for what happens for the Rockets and whatnot. I do think it's going to be Donovan Clingan, number 1 to Atlanta. I think Alex Sarr, number 2 to the Washington Wizards. I think the Rockets take Reed Sheppard, number 3. Spurs are going to take Zachary Risacher, number 4. And then this one's going to be a bit of a reach, but I think it happens. I think Dalton Connect at number 5 to the Pistons. Dalton Connect, now that might be a bit of a reach, Dalton Connect at number 5, but the Pistons, they have a lot of upside talent on their roster with Cade, with Jaden Ivey. Like, they've got some big hitters over there. They need to figure out how to play together. But they also desperately need shooting in like the worst way. Like, they just need some shooting around Cade and Ivy to get things a little bit cleaner over there. They might pursue Tobias Harris. Who knows what's going on there? I mean, I just, that's at least how I have the top 5 picks kind of mocked out in my head. And so the Rockets are likely not even going to be in a position where they have both Clingan and Reed Sheppard on the board for it to matter. But I've made this point a few different times throughout this pre-draft cycle, and I want to say it one more time here. Whoever the Rockets ultimately take with pick number 3, if they stay at pick number 3 and they draft somebody, that player, the likelihood of that player breaking into the Rockets rotation and being like a significant contributor this next season, very, very slim chance. Like, the Rockets have a very, very strong 9-man rotation as is. Now, maybe it's Reed, maybe it's Clingan, who knows, and whichever player it is, yeah, they have a chance to break into the rotation, and then the Rockets have a really strong 10-man rotation to get through the regular season. But I just want Rockets fans to temper their expectations a little bit, because it's not going to be, oh, they draft Reed Sheppard and then he's immediately the backup point guard and he's going to get 15 to 20 minutes a night playing behind Fred VanVleet. That's probably not going to be the case whatsoever. Whoever they take at number 3, if they stay there, is probably going to be a slow play. They're going to develop them, throughout the season. They'll probably spend some time with the G League, with the Vipers, just like Cam Whitmore did, right? Cam really kind of wasn't ready to play at the NBA level. He came in really raw, and some of these other prospects might be more ready to play right out of the gate than Cam Whitmore was, but they just don't have the opportunity. They don't have the developmental runway in the rotation to make it happen. So that's what I think ultimately happens. I'm honestly a big fan of both of the players. I'm not going to be upset if the Rockets walk away with Donovan Clingan at number 3. I think Reed Sheppard's the cleaner fit, and I do think that over their respective careers, let's say 10 years down the line, I think we're going to look back and think that Reed Sheppard is probably going to be overall the better player than Donovan Clingan, the more impactful player, because a lot of it hinges on how Donovan Clingan's offense kind of develops. Whereas Reed Sheppard, we already know the floor is incredibly high on him. I think he's got starting caliber NBA point guard written all over him for years to come. So with that, what do you think the Rockets are going to do? What are your final predictions for NBA draft night? And then as far as the star hunting conversation, how do you feel about the Rockets potentially being in the market for some of those big names? Are there any of those big names that you would want to see them make a push for? Are any of those names worthy of giving up one of the young prospects, one of the core 6? Let me know in those YouTube comments. As always, thank you so much for checking out the show. If you haven't done so yet, please consider subscribing wherever you listen to your podcasts, or on YouTube, just search Locked On Rockets. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, a 5-star review helps out a ton. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. And I look forward to having you back right here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball.